There's a moment that happens to every married man, usually around 3 in the morning when he can't sleep. He's lying there next to his wife, listening to her breathe, and suddenly he remembers what it felt like to be completely alone. Not lonely, but alone, free, sovereign over his own existence. And in that moment, something twists in his chest, something he'll never admit at breakfast. That twist is envy, pure and simple, directed at a man he used to be. Or perhaps at a man he sees walking past him on the street. A man with no ring on his finger, no shared bank account, no negotiations about whose parents to visit on holidays. Schopenhauer understood this better than almost anyone who's ever put pen to paper. The German philosopher, famous for his brutal honesty about human nature, once wrote that marriage is a trap disguised as a sanctuary, and that statement wasn't cynicism, it was observation. Because what Schopenhauer recognized, what every honest married man eventually discovers, is that the institution of marriage doesn't complete a man, it fragments him. It takes the unified will of a sovereign individual and splits it into competing obligations, divided loyalties, and endless negotiations. The single man wakes up and asks himself one question: what do I want to do today? The married man wakes up and asks himself a different question: what do we need to do today? That shift from I to we seems small, almost trivial, the kind of thing you'd expect from commitment and partnership. But Schopenhauer recognized it as the fundamental transformation that marriage imposes, the dissolution of individual will into collective will. And with that dissolution comes the death of a certain kind of freedom that can never be fully recovered. Before we go deeper into why this happens, before we explore the mechanisms of this envy and what it reveals about human nature, I need to know something about you, because this message hits differently depending on where you are in your journey. Drop a comment right now and tell me what city you're watching this from. Are you in New York scrolling through this during your commute? Los Angeles watching this before bed? Maybe you're somewhere in Texas, the Midwest, or you're watching from another country entirely? London, Toronto, Sydney? I want to know because what we're about to discuss transcends geography, but manifests differently depending on culture. And I'm genuinely curious where this truth is landing, where these ideas are resonating. So pause for just 5 seconds, comment your city, and let's build a map of where this understanding is taking root. Now let's talk about why every husband, whether he admits it or not, looks at the solitary man with a particular kind of hunger in his eyes. The marriage contract, Schopenhauer argued, is fundamentally a negotiation where both parties surrender autonomy for the promise of security and companionship. On the surface, this seems like a reasonable trade. Human beings need connection. They need intimacy. They need someone to share the burden of existence. But here's the cruel mathematics of that exchange that nobody wants to acknowledge. You cannot trade freedom for security and somehow gain more freedom in the process. It's a net loss always. The numbers don't work any other way. Every gain in one column requires a corresponding loss in another. The married man wakes up and immediately begins a series of compromises that have become so routine, he barely notices them anymore. What he eats for breakfast might be determined by what his wife bought at the grocery store, or by her dietary preferences, or by what needs to be used before it expires, or by what fits into the household budget that they've agreed upon. Where he works is constrained by location, by the need to maintain a certain income level that supports not just himself, but a household, by proximity to his wife's job or to good school districts if children are involved. How he spends his evening is no longer a pure expression of his desires, but a negotiation, spoken or unspoken, with another person's needs, moods, expectations, and energy levels. Whether he can take that job opportunity in another city, whether he can pursue that risky business venture, whether he can spend Saturday doing what he wants instead of what the household needs, all of these become questions requiring consultation, compromise, and often, surrender. The man who walks alone faces none of these frictions. His breakfast is whatever he wants, whenever he wants it, or no breakfast at all if that's what suits him. His evening is a blank canvas, genuinely open to whatever impulse strikes him, whether that's productive work, leisure, social engagement, or complete solitude. His weekend is not a series of obligations masquerading as choices, but a genuine expanse of possibility. He can say yes to the unexpected invitation, the spontaneous road trip, the last-minute opportunity, without needing to check with anyone, without needing to consider how his choice affects someone else's plans or feelings. And this pure optionality, this radical openness of the future, is what the married man envies most. Not the solitary man's loneliness, not his lack of companionship, not even his sexual freedom, though that's part of it. What the married man truly envies is the solitary man's absolute dominion over his own time, his own space, his own life, his own future. The solitary man is sovereign. The married man is a constitutional monarch at best, bound by agreements and precedents, and the need to maintain domestic peace. Schopenhauer went further, though, and this is where his analysis becomes almost surgical in its precision. He recognized that marriage doesn't just constrain a man's external freedoms, the obvious things like time and money and location. Marriage begins to reshape his internal landscape, his very personality and sense of self. The married man must develop what we might call a diplomatic personality, a version of himself that is calibrated for constant proximity to another human being. He learns to modulate his moods because his bad mood affects the household atmosphere. He learns to suppress certain thoughts because voicing them would create conflict or hurt feelings. He learns to perform emotional labor that would be completely unnecessary if he lived alone, remembering anniversaries, noticing when his wife has had her hair done, asking about her day even when he's exhausted, managing not just his own emotional state, but contributing to the management of hers. He becomes, in a very real sense, an actor in his own life, always aware of his audience of one, always adjusting his performance to maintain relationship harmony. This isn't necessarily dishonest. It's the price of proximity, the cost of sharing space with another consciousness. But it is a cost, and it's one that compounds over time. Think about the last time you saw a married man completely alone, perhaps at a bar while traveling for work, or in his car during a long commute, or in a hotel room on a business trip. There's often a visible relaxation that happens, a dropping of the mask, a return to an older version of himself that predates marriage. His shoulders drop, his face softens. He orders what he actually wants instead of what he should want. He spends his time exactly as he pleases without considering anyone else's preferences or judgments. In those moments, he's not being a husband, not being a father if he has children, not being the responsible provider and partner. He's just being. Pure existence without social role. And that state of pure being, unmediated by relationship obligations, is something the man who walks alone inhabits constantly. It's his default state, his natural condition, not a rare treat stolen from the margins of a structured life. This is why Schopenhauer called marriage a debt that you contract in your youth and pay off in your old age. The metaphor is precise. The debt isn't primarily financial, though that's certainly part of it, given that married households cost more to maintain than single ones, and divorce is financially catastrophic for most men. The debt is existential. You borrow against your future freedom to purchase present companionship, to satisfy social expectations, to fulfill biological imperatives, to escape the discomfort of being alone. And the interest compounds daily. Every year of marriage adds another layer of shared history that makes separation more complicated, another set of mutual obligations that must be honored, another tightening of the bonds that, paradoxically, were supposed to set you free through love. The marriage that begins as a choice becomes, over time, a necessity, something you cannot escape without destroying the entire structure of your life. But let's address the obvious counter-argument, because I can feel some of you pushing back against this analysis. Doesn't marriage provide profound benefits that the solitary man misses out on? Absolutely. Companionship in its deepest form, partnership in facing life's challenges, shared meaning that comes from building something together, the profound satisfaction of being truly known by another person, the particular joy that comes from inside jokes and shared history, the practical benefits of two incomes and divided labor. These are all real and valuable. Schopenhauer wasn't denying this. He wasn't stupid or blind to the genuine goods that marriage can provide. What he was saying, what he was insisting upon with characteristic bluntness, is that we systematically lie to ourselves about the exchange rate. We pretend that you can have all the benefits of marriage, all the intimacy and partnership and shared meaning, without corresponding cost to autonomy. We pretend that love somehow exempts you from the basic mathematics of commitment, where saying yes to one thing necessarily means saying no to everything else. And that pretense, that refusal to count the costs honestly, creates a cognitive dissonance that manifests as envy toward those who chose differently. The man who walks alone represents the road not taken, the alternative timeline, the life that might have been. And human beings are psychologically wired to wonder about alternative paths, especially when the path they've chosen reveals its thorns, when the romance fades and the daily grind of maintaining a relationship becomes apparent, when you realize that marriage is less like a fairy tale and more like a job that you can never quit, and that doesn't offer vacation time, Every married man, at some point, sits down with a calculator in his mind and runs the numbers on the counterfactual. What would my life look like if I had remained single? More money, certainly, given that married households may share expenses but also tend to inflate lifestyle standards, and given that everything from housing to cars to vacations becomes more expensive when you're considering two people's preferences. More time, absolutely, given that relationships consume hours daily in conversation, in coordination, in emotional management, in simply being present for another person even when you'd rather be alone. More freedom of movement, without question, able to relocate for opportunities without needing to consider a spouse's career, able to travel on impulse without coordination, able to restructure life radically without needing to convince another person or compromise on a shared vision. More sexual variety, potentially, depending on your attractiveness and social skills. Free to pursue novelty without guilt or secrecy. More space, both literal and psychological, to be yourself without performance or adjustment. And here's where Schopenhauer's insight becomes almost uncomfortable in its precision, almost cruel in how accurately it describes a common psychological pattern. He observed that the married man cannot fully admit this envy, even to himself in the privacy of his own thoughts, because to do so would be to acknowledge that he made a miscalculation, that he traded something irreplaceable for something that, while valuable, doesn't quite compensate for the loss. The ego rebels against this admission with tremendous force. We are psychologically wired to justify our major life decisions, to construct narratives that make us the heroes of our own stories, to believe that we chose wisely and that our lives are unfolding according to plan. Admitting that marriage was a bad trade, or even an ambiguous trade, threatens that narrative structure. So instead, the married man develops elaborate defense mechanisms. He constructs narratives about maturity, about how choosing relationship over freedom is the adult thing to do, the evolved thing, the sophisticated choice that shallow people don't understand. He tells himself that the solitary man must be lonely, must be emotionally stunted, must be unable to commit or afraid of intimacy or secretly miserable behind his facade of freedom. These narratives serve a psychological function. They're not primarily descriptive, they're protective. They protect the married man from the full weight of his envy by transforming it into pity or condescension. If he can believe that the solitary man is actually suffering, is actually worse off, then his own choice is vindicated, his sacrifice is meaningful, his loss of freedom is justified. But watch what happens when a married man encounters a solitary man who refuses to fit this narrative, who is genuinely thriving, who is physically fit and professionally successful and socially connected and obviously enjoying his autonomy, who shows no signs of the loneliness or immaturity that he's supposed to display. The cognitive dissonance becomes almost unbearable. The defensive narratives start to crack. The condescension becomes harder to maintain, because this thriving solitary man is living proof that the narrative was always a cope, always a way of managing uncomfortable feelings, rather than an accurate description of reality. In these encounters, you can sometimes see the mask slip on the married man's face, see the naked envy break through before he reasserts control and retreats into his protective stories. Schopenhauer himself never married, and he was quite explicit and unapologetic about why. He valued his philosophical work above all else, above companionship, above social approval, above the biological imperative to reproduce, and he recognized with perfect clarity that marriage would necessarily compromise his ability to pursue truth without constraint. Philosophy, real philosophy, not academic game-playing but genuine inquiry into the nature of existence, requires a particular kind of freedom. You need the freedom to think dangerous thoughts without worrying about how they'll affect your family's social standing. You need the freedom to write unpopular ideas without considering how they might damage your spouse's career or reputation. You need the freedom to structure your days entirely around intellectual production rather than domestic harmony, to follow a thought wherever it leads, even if that means neglecting household obligations, to be absolutely selfish with your time and energy because the work demands it. Could Schopenhauer have done this while married? Perhaps some men have managed it, but it would have been harder, more fraught, requiring constant negotiation of time and space and mental energy, requiring a wife who was willing to subordinate her needs to his work, which is its own kind of problematic dynamic. The question then becomes, and this is the question every man must answer for himself, what does the solitary man possess that creates this envy? And is it something that can be reclaimed within marriage? Or is it fundamentally incompatible with the married state? Can you be married and free, or is that a contradiction in terms? Let's start by examining the components of what the solitary man has, breaking down this freedom into its constituent parts. First, there's time sovereignty, the ability to structure your hours according to your own priorities without negotiation or justification. The married man operates on shared time, where evening hours are presumed to be together, time unless otherwise negotiated, where weekends are joint assets requiring coordination and compromise, where vacations must accommodate two people's preferences and two sets of family obligations. The solitary man operates on private time, where every hour is his to allocate as he sees fit, where he answers to no one about how he spends his evening or his weekend or his vacation days. This isn't merely about quantity of time, though married men do objectively have less discretionary time. It's about the qualitative experience of time. When you know that your evening belongs entirely to you, that no one will interrupt your focus unless you invite them to, that you can pursue a project or a rest period to its natural conclusion without external demands or guilt about neglecting a partner, time itself feels different. It expands, it becomes more useful. You can enter flow states more easily because you're not constantly monitoring for relationship obligations. The married man experiences time as perpetually fragmented, always aware that he exists within a shared schedule, that his preferences are just one input into a collective decision-making process, that using time for himself requires either explicit negotiation or creates implicit debt that must be repaid later. Then there's emotional autonomy, the capacity to experience and process your emotional states without immediate social obligation or impact. The married man comes home in a bad mood, and that mood immediately becomes a shared problem requiring management. His wife notices the mood, asks what's wrong, perhaps takes it personally if he won't open up, perhaps becomes frustrated that he's bringing negative energy into the home, perhaps tries to fix whatever's bothering him when he'd rather just sit with it. His internal state is no longer entirely internal. It radiates outward and affects the household ecosystem, which means he bears responsibility not just for his own emotions, but for how they impact his partner. This creates pressure to regulate emotions in ways that aren't natural or healthy, to perform cheerfulness when you're not cheerful, to explain and justify your moods, to resolve them quickly rather than allowing them to run their natural course. The solitary man experiences emotions in private. He can be angry, melancholy, frustrated, ecstatic, or completely numb without those states requiring explanation, management, or modulation for another person's comfort. If he wants to process the emotion by talking about it, he can seek out a friend, but it's optional rather than obligatory. If he wants to sit with the emotion in silence, he can do that without anyone taking it personally. His emotional life is his own, processed at his own pace, resolved or not resolved according to his own timeline and methods. This doesn't mean he's emotionally stunted or avoidant. It means his emotional life isn't constantly being monitored and reacted to by another person with their own needs and insecurities. Financial autonomy represents another critical dimension of the divide between married and solitary men. The married man's money is rarely entirely his own, even if accounts are technically separate, and there's no legal commingling. Major financial decisions require discussion because they affect the household. Purchases beyond a certain threshold need justification because your partner wants to understand your priorities and ensure they align with shared goals. Spending patterns are observed and sometimes judged because financial choices reveal values, and values within a marriage are supposed to be negotiated and shared. The married man who wants to buy something expensive for himself, whether it's a car or a watch or camera equipment or whatever his particular interest is, faces a conversation where he has to defend that purchase against alternative uses of the money that might benefit the household or his partner. Even if his partner ultimately agrees, the fact that he needed agreement, that his desire wasn't sufficient in itself, represents a constraint. The solitary man's financial life is radically simpler and more autonomous. He earns, he spends, or saves according to his own values and priorities, and no purchase requires explanation or justification to anyone. If he wants to spend $3,000 on something frivolous because it brings him joy, he can do that without guilt, without negotiation, without needing to convince anyone that it's worthwhile. If he wants to take a financial risk on a business venture, he bears the consequences alone, without imposing them on a partner. This creates a psychological freedom that extends far beyond mere transactions. It's the freedom from being monitored, from having your priorities questioned, from needing to defend your choices and align them with someone else's vision of what matters. Sexual autonomy might be the most controversial dimension to discuss openly, But Schopenhauer certainly didn't shy away from uncomfortable topics, so neither will we. The married man has theoretically guaranteed sexual access to his partner, and this is often cited as one of the primary benefits of marriage, the solution to the problem of securing consistent intimacy. But that access comes with profound constraints that are rarely acknowledged in the sales pitch for marriage. Sex must happen within the boundaries of the relationship's negotiated norms, within the comfort zone of both partners, which often means it becomes predictable and routine over time. It requires ongoing emotional maintenance of the relationship, because most women, and many men, cannot separate sexual desire from emotional connection, which means sexual frequency is tied to relationship satisfaction, creating a dynamic where sex becomes a kind of reward for good behavior, or is withheld during conflict. It's subject to the vicissitudes of your partner's mood and desire and energy level, which means your sexual satisfaction is dependent on someone else's state rather than your own. And it's exclusive, meaning all other options are theoretically foreclosed. All other attractions must be suppressed. All sexual novelty must come from the same person over decades, which fights against how male sexuality in particular is wired. The solitary man faces the challenge of finding sexual partners without the infrastructure of marriage, and depending on his attractiveness, social skills, and effort, this might be easy or difficult. But once found, those encounters happen without the emotional overhead of maintaining a long-term relationship, without the need to sustain attraction and desire over decades, without the sexual boredom that even the happiest marriages eventually confront, without the guilt that comes from having sexual thoughts about anyone other than your partner. He trades consistency for variety, guarantee for adventure, the comfort of the known for the excitement of the unknown. And for many men, if they're honest with themselves, that trade is more favorable than they're socially allowed to admit. Schopenhauer recognized that sexual desire is one of nature's cruelest tricks, the biological imperative that drives men into commitments that serve the species' need for reproduction, while systematically undermining individual happiness. The married man is, in this framework, a servant to the species, sacrificing personal freedom and sexual variety for the continuation of genetic lineage. The solitary man who resists this biological programming, who chooses autonomy over reproduction, who refuses to let his sexual desire drive him into permanent commitment, is enacting a small rebellion against nature itself, asserting individual will over biological determinism. This is precisely why society applies such enormous pressure to marry and reproduce, through social expectations, through religious doctrine, through the romanticization of marriage in media and culture, through the stigmatization of men who remain single past a certain age. Because if too many individuals made the rational calculation that freedom produces more happiness than family, that autonomy is more valuable than partnership, the species would face a crisis. Society needs men to marry, needs them to become domesticated and productive and focused on providing for families rather than pursuing individual satisfaction. The pressure to marry isn't primarily about individual well-being. It's about social stability and reproduction rates. Now, some of you are thinking, this is a deeply cynical view of marriage. And you're right, it absolutely is. Schopenhauer was nothing if not cynical about human institutions and motivations. He saw through the romantic narratives to the biological and social machinery underneath, and he reported what he saw without sentiment or sugarcoating. But cynicism isn't the same as inaccuracy, and pessimism isn't the same as falsehood. The question isn't whether Schopenhauer's view is optimistic or pessimistic, uplifting or depressing. The question is whether it's true, whether it accurately describes the reality that many men experience, even if they lack the framework to articulate it. And the evidence suggests that for a significant portion of men, there's a profound truth being described here, even if it's uncomfortable, even if acknowledging it feels like betrayal of their marriages or admission of failure. Look at the divorce statistics. Roughly half of marriages end in divorce in most Western countries, and of those that remain intact, how many are genuinely satisfying for both partners versus merely endured out of inertia, financial necessity, or fear of disruption? Look at the data on male happiness, which often shows a measurable dip in reported life satisfaction after marriage, and particularly after children arrive, even as society insists that these milestones should increase happiness. Look at the revealed preferences of men who have been divorced, many of whom, despite the financial and emotional devastation of divorce, choose not to remarry, having learned the lesson experientially that the costs of marriage outweigh the benefits, at least for them. But here's where we need to introduce an important nuance that Schopenhauer himself, in his blanket dismissal of marriage, might not have fully appreciated, or at least didn't emphasize. The envy that married men feel toward the solitary man isn't necessarily a sign that they made the wrong choice in marrying, isn't proof that marriage is always and everywhere a bad deal. It might instead be a sign that they entered marriage with false expectations, with a romanticized view of what partnership means, with a failure to count the costs honestly before paying the price, with an assumption that marriage would complete them or make them happy, rather than simply trading one set of challenges for another. If a man enters marriage with clear eyes, understanding that he's trading autonomy for partnership, freedom for stability, optionality for commitment, understanding that this trade involves real costs that won't be magically offset by love, then the trade can be made consciously and without resentment. The envy emerges when the trade was made unconsciously, when society's narrative about marriage as the path to fulfillment obscured the genuine costs, when the man simply followed the expected script without examining whether it aligned with his actual values and personality, when he wakes up 5 or 10 or 20 years later and realizes he didn't understand what he was signing up for, didn't know himself well enough to predict how he'd respond to the constraints of partnership. This is why Schopenhauer's philosophy, brutal and unromantic as it is, provides a genuine service to anyone willing to engage with it seriously. It strips away the romantic mythology and forces us to look at marriage as an actual institution with real costs and benefits rather than as a fairy tale with a guaranteed happy ending. It treats marriage as a contract worth reading carefully before signing, rather than a sacrament that transcends analysis. The man who walks alone, then, becomes a mirror showing the married man what he gave up, and mirrors are profoundly uncomfortable things when we don't like what they reflect. They show us the roads not taken, the selves we might have been, the freedoms we no longer possess, the choices we made that cannot be unmade without tremendous cost. The healthy response isn't to smash the mirror or to denigrate the reflection or to insist that the mirror is lying. The healthy response is to look at what the mirror shows you and then decide, with full consciousness and honesty, whether the trade you made was worth it on its actual terms rather than on the idealized terms society sold you. For some married men, honest reflection reveals that yes, despite all the costs that we've discussed, despite the loss of autonomy and time and freedom and sexual variety, the partnership is worth it. The shared meaning they've built, the companionship they experience, the family they've created, the deep knowledge of being fully known by another person, these genuinely do compensate for what was surrendered. For these men, the envy they feel toward the solitary man is real but manageable, acknowledged but not defining, a recognition of cost that doesn't negate the value of what was purchased. For other men, honest reflection reveals a profound mistake, a trade made under false pretenses that cannot be undone without tremendous disruption and cost, without financial devastation and social stigma, and the pain of separation, and possibly the loss of daily contact with children. These men live with a kind of quiet desperation, aware that they're trapped in a situation they would not choose if they could choose again, but unable to escape without destroying everything they've built. And for many men, perhaps most, the truth lies somewhere in between these extremes, in a mixed state where the calculation isn't clear-cut. Some days the trade feels absolutely worth it, when connection is strong and partnership is functioning well and the benefits are vivid. Other days it feels like a terrible mistake, when conflict is high or freedom feels especially constrained, or the solitary man's life looks especially appealing. The envy of the solitary man coexists with genuine love for their partner. Resentment of constraints coexists with appreciation for stability. The desire for freedom coexists with fear of loneliness. Schopenhauer would argue that this mixed state, this ambivalence, is actually the most common and most human response, because we are creatures of contradictory desires, wanting both freedom and connection, both autonomy and intimacy, both the adventure of the unknown and the security of the familiar, both sexual variety and emotional depth with one person. We want mutually exclusive things, and so whatever we choose will leave part of our nature unsatisfied. We'll create a longing for what we didn't choose. The man who walks alone has chosen one side of this equation decisively, and in doing so, he becomes a living reminder to the married man of what decisive choice looks like, of what it means to prioritize one set of values over another, without compromise or ambivalence. There's a particular species of envy that emerges when the married man sees the solitary man making decisions quickly and unilaterally, watching him plan an international trip on a whim because a flight deal appeared, change careers without needing to consult anyone or consider how the transition period might affect a household, move to a new city because an opportunity arose, and he can simply say yes without coordinating another person's job and social connections, pursue a risky, entrepreneurial venture without worrying about how failure might affect a family's stability and standard of living. The married man has traded this kind of radical agency for stability and partnership, and watching someone exercise that agency creates a visceral response in the body, a physical sensation of constraint, of being caged. It's not even that he necessarily wants to take that spontaneous trip or make that radical career change. It's that he wants the option to do so. He wants to know that he could if he chose to, and he no longer has that option. The option itself, the pure potentiality, the openness of the future, is what's been surrendered, and watching someone else possess it creates a hunger that's almost painful. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he talked about the burden of existence and the nature of human desire. Every choice we make closes off other possibilities. Every commitment is a kind of death to the unchosen paths. Every yes is simultaneously 1,000 no's. Marriage is perhaps the most significant commitment most people ever make, and therefore it represents the most significant closing off of alternative futures. The married man envies the solitary man because the solitary man still has his future relatively open, still retains the capacity to radically reinvent himself at any moment, still possesses the optionality that the married man traded away for the security of partnership. The solitary man is possibility itself. The married man is actuality, chosen and locked in. And yet, and this is critical for intellectual honesty, we must acknowledge the solitary man's vulnerabilities, because this isn't a one-sided equation where freedom always wins and marriage always loses. The solitary man faces his own set of challenges and potential regrets. There's the genuine possibility of deep loneliness, not the temporary loneliness that can be cured by social engagement, but the existential loneliness of having no one who shares your history, no one who knows your full story and loves you anyway, no one whose life is fundamentally intertwined with yours. There's the lack of built-in social structure that marriage provides, the automatic invitations to family events and couples dinners, and the social world that organizes itself around pair bonds. There's the reality that as he ages, as health declines and energy wanes and peers settle into family life, his solitude may become more burdensome rather than liberating, more isolating than free. There's the possibility that on his deathbed, he'll regret not having built something lasting with another person, not having children to carry forward his legacy, not having experienced the particular kind of love that only comes from decades of partnership. Schopenhauer was honest about this too, noting that while marriage might be a trap, a debt paid over decades, being alone also has its pains, particularly as we move toward death and contemplate facing that final transition without intimate companionship, without someone whose life would be fundamentally altered by our absence. The envy, then, might flow in both directions at different life stages. The young married man in his 30s, still vital and energetic, envies the young single man's freedom and options. But the old single man in his 70s, facing declining health and increasing isolation, might envy the old married man's companionship and built-in care network, and sense that his life mattered deeply to at least one other person. The difference in these envies is important, though. The married man's envy is for something concrete, something he once had and consciously gave up. He knows exactly what freedom felt like because he experienced it. He lived as a single man before becoming a married man, and he can compare the two states directly. His envy is based on lived experience, an actual knowledge of what he's missing. The lifelong solitary man's potential envy is for something more abstract, more theoretical, something he never actually experienced. He doesn't know what 40 years of marriage feels like, doesn't know the particular joys and comforts of that depth of partnership, and so his potential regret is based on imagination rather than memory. And theoretical regrets are significantly easier to manage than concrete ones, because you can never be certain what you actually missed. You can construct narratives that make your choice seem wise, whereas the married man knows precisely what he surrendered because he lived it. The practical question then becomes, what should the married man actually do with this envy when it arises, as it inevitably will, in those 3 a.m. moments of clarity, or when encountering a thriving solitary man who embodies the freedom he gave up? Suppressing the envy entirely seems psychologically unhealthy, leading to resentment that festers below consciousness, passive aggression toward his wife who becomes the symbol of his constraint, eventual eruption in midlife crisis when the accumulated pressure becomes unbearable. But admitting the envy openly to his wife likely causes significant relationship damage, because few partners want to hear that their husband sometimes wishes he was alone. that he experiences their shared life as constraint, that he looks at single men with longing? The answer, and Schopenhauer might suggest this, though he didn't write extensively on practical wisdom for the married man since he wasn't one, lies in radical honesty with oneself, combined with pragmatic discretion with others. Acknowledge internally, in your own private thoughts, that the envy is real and valid, that it points to genuine costs of marriage that you're bearing every day, that freedom has intrinsic value that wasn't magically eliminated by saying I do. Don't gaslight yourself about this. Don't construct elaborate narratives about how you don't really want freedom, or how the solitary man is secretly miserable. Face the reality of what you traded and what you received in return, and then, having faced it clearly, decide consciously whether those costs are worth continuing to pay. If yes, if honest calculation reveals that despite everything, the partnership and companionship and shared meaning are worth the price, then pay those costs without resentment, with full awareness of what you're choosing and why. Stop envying the solitary man, and instead own your choice, take responsibility for it. Extract maximum value from what you chose. If honest reflection reveals that the costs genuinely outweigh the benefits, that you're staying married out of inertia or fear or social pressure, rather than genuine belief in the value of the partnership, then you face the difficult calculus of whether the disruption and cost of divorce is worth reclaiming your autonomy. That's a calculation only you can make, weighing financial devastation and social stigma and impact on children against the value of freedom and the remaining years of your life. But whatever you decide it consciously rather than living in unconscious resentment or unexamined envy, rather than sleepwalking through a life you didn't actively choose. The man who walks alone will continue to exist as a cultural figure, as an archetype, as a reminder of the road not taken, as a mirror reflecting what was surrendered. He'll walk past you on the street, sit near you at restaurants, appear in your social media feed, living a life of adventure and autonomy. Your relationship to that figure, whether it's envy or pity or indifference or some complex mixture, tells you something important about your own choices and values and whether you're living in alignment with them. Schopenhauer's gift to intellectual history was his willingness to articulate uncomfortable truths that most people prefer to leave unexamined, to say out loud what everyone thinks, but no one admits. Marriage is not a unilateral good that automatically improves every life it touches. Freedom is not a unilateral good that leads inevitably to happiness. Every significant life choice involves genuine trade-offs, costs that are real even if the benefits are also real, and pretending otherwise creates psychological suffering. The married man who envies the solitary man is not broken or ungrateful or immature. He's human, responding naturally and honestly to the recognition of costs that society told him didn't exist or didn't matter, that the romantic narrative of marriage completely obscured. Now, I want you to do something that connects directly to what we've just explored together. Something that transforms this from passive consumption of ideas into active engagement with your own reality. In the comments right now, write this exact phrase and complete it with your honest truth. I chose X because Y, where X is either marriage or solitude, and Y is your real reason, not the socially acceptable reason, not the reason you tell others, but the actual driver of your choice. Maybe it's, I chose marriage because I feared being alone and couldn't face that fear. Or, I chose solitude because I value my freedom above all companionship. Or, I chose marriage because everyone expected it and I didn't know I could say no. Or, I chose solitude because I saw what marriage did to my father and refused that fate. Or something entirely different, something uniquely yours. This isn't about judgment. This is about the kind of honesty Schopenhauer demanded from himself, and from anyone willing to think clearly about human existence, rather than hiding behind comfortable lies. Write that phrase and complete it truthfully, because in naming our choices and our reasons, we take ownership of them. We transform unconscious drift into conscious decision. We move from being victims of circumstance to authors of our lives. And after you write that comment, after you've been honest about your choice, subscribe to this channel. Because what we do here is exactly this kind of unflinching examination of ideas that matter. Ideas that actually affect how you live your life rather than abstract academic exercises that have no connection to reality. We don't do surface-level content designed to make you feel good. We go deep into the philosophies and thinkers who understood human nature at its most fundamental level, who weren't afraid to describe what they saw, even when it was ugly or uncomfortable. And we apply those insights to the real challenges you face in modern life. The challenges around relationship and meaning and freedom, and how to actually live well, rather than just survive. Click that subscribe button right now. Hit the like button to tell the algorithm that this kind of honest exploration matters, that there's an audience for truth even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable, because the algorithms are designed to promote comfort and validation, and we need to actively fight against that if we want access to ideas that actually challenge us and help us grow. Because the next video we have coming will challenge another assumption you probably haven't examined closely enough. Another area where society's narrative and your lived reality might not quite align. Another opportunity to see yourself and your choices more clearly, without the distorting lens of social expectations and romantic mythology. You won't want to miss what's coming next, because once you start seeing through the comfortable lies we tell ourselves, once you develop the capacity to look directly at reality without flinching, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to the naive acceptance of whatever story society is selling. And that clarity, that ability to make choices with full awareness rather than operating on autopilot, that willingness to count the costs honestly before paying them, that's where real freedom begins. Whether you're married or walking alone, whether you chose partnership or solitude, because freedom isn't ultimately about your relationship status, it's about the relationship you have with truth.